Back when I did my top 100, I made sure to fill it with games that were personal to me. Seems like an obvious thing, but whenever I'd thought about doing such a thing in the past, I wondered if I should try and play all, or at least some, of the great games I'd missed over the years to see if they should get in too. Naturally, this was quickly dismissed as a ludicrous undertaking and the whole project would be binned until I just thought, screw it, and put the games I know and love on there, not caring about all the, hey, why isn't this in here, or you missed X comments that would result. And of those comments, there's pretty clearly one series that stood out as the one which Kim barely knows anything about. And that is, of course, The Legend of Zelda. I mean, sure, one game made it in, that being the one that I played, hell, perhaps the one that everybody's played at some point, but the rest, nope. I have little to no experience with the Zelda series, as huge and as loved as it is. The reason for this is kinda simple. I'm a Sega kid. I didn't play the original game because I didn't have a NES. I didn't play Link's Awakening, I didn't have a Game Boy. I had a Game Gear. Although I did play Axe Battler a lot, which is basically a Zelda clone, so maybe that counts? No, of course it doesn't. Ocarina of Time and Majora's Mask? No N64. Wind Waker? No GameCube. And so on and so on. It's not that I dislike Nintendo or anything, I just always picked another system aside from theirs. So while is The Legend of Zelda still worth playing today, might be a ludicrous question for some, I don't know, it's actually worth asking for me considering how little experience I have with it. And recently I kind of got the urge to educate myself a bit, starting with that very first game. The first Legend of Zelda, the one on that nice gold cartridge made all those years ago, is a good subject for this intermittent series that's also covered obscure gems like Half-Life and Prince of Persia in the past. It's the game that started a whole train after all, not just of Zelda games but of tons of others like it, all of which made changes, riffs and evolutions on the original formula. But when you strip all of those things away and go back to what Zelda was at the beginning, what's there today? I've never played the game in any kind of depth, and seeing as you don't need experience to do anything in this day and age, I think I can try and find out what makes Zelda the game it is without having any nostalgia towards it. And plus again, I want to educate myself. I don't come to this game with any bias against it or anything. It's not indifference, it's just, well, ignorance. But it would also be worth having a quick look at the game itself and seeing what inspired it, and what made it just so frickin' big, even if that also might be kind of well known. As the story from Great Lord Shigeru Miyamoto himself goes, The Legend of Zelda was inspired, in part, by his adventures as a child. He used to go off gallivanting around the countryside, looking into forests, taking a lantern into caves and that sort of thing, and when he grew up he wanted to put that same sort of nervous excitement into a game. There are also some games that can probably also be cited as inspirations, mind. On the Atari 2600 you've obviously got Adventure, pretty much the first graphical action adventure ever. On the same machine you also perhaps have Raiders of the Lost Ark as another inspiration. A pretty awful game, but a similarly open-ended piece of work. As for Japanese games, there's Namco's arcade action adventure The Tower of Jiraga, which does have a few graphical similarities with Zelda, and of course 1984's Hydlide. Again, this might not be a good game at all, but it's pretty much the first Japanese action RPG. A lot of people tend to take Shiguru's more whimsical take on Zelda's inspiration as gospel, of course, although it's fair to say that there was some inspiration from other games there. Not that it mattered, because The Legend of Zelda took everything up several notches. Development started even while Miyamoto and company were still working on Super Mario Bros., and it took over a year for Shigzy, co-designer Takashi Tezuka and the rest of the team to put the whole thing together. The overworld itself consists of 128 screens compared to, say, the 25 or so that made up Hydlide's world, not to mention the 9 dungeons, all the enemies, the items, and the many secrets. It was not arguably, but definitely the most complex game yet to be released on a console at the time, February 21st, 1986. It would also be the lead game for Nintendo's big add-on to the Famicom Disk System, which proclaimed that it would be able to offer brand new experiences for the user, with games at a cheaper price due to not being on cartridge, and discs that were rewritable. Kind of important for The Legend of Zelda, as that meant the game could be saved. After all, this wasn't something that could be completed in just one sitting. The result, of course, was another huge game for Nintendo, coming just 4 months after the release of Mario, selling over 1.5 million copies in Japan alone and eventually over 9 million worldwide. When it came out in the West in late 1987, it did it all over again, a monster hit. It was also the first game to use a battery backup in the cartridge in order to replicate the save function on the original Japanese disc, and the first game that had a strategy guide published along with it. And it inspired, well, hundreds of imitators. The amount of games that were heavily influenced by, or just flat out rip-offs of Zelda is kinda ludicrous, ranging from the great and the good to the bad and, well, the kind of weird. Everything from brilliant action RPGs to strange Bible games took a ton of inspiration from The Legend of Zelda. It's crazy influential. And obviously it kicked off a massive franchise of its own that to date has sold over 100 million copies worldwide. But of course your humble host didn't know much about any of this. I only remember Zelda at the time from the odd comic or feature in a magazine here and there, and of course choose your own adventure books. These were the only way I experienced either Zelda or indeed Mario for quite a while. But now? Well, it's time to look at the original at last and just see how much I dig it. If you let the iconic title screen run, you get the story. The Triforce of Power has been stolen by, of all people, Prince Darkness Ganon. Now I have to say I've called Ganon many things in my time, but I've never thought of him as a Prince of Darkness. All joking aside, this is of course Ganon, Perpetual series villain. He wants the other Triforce, the Triforce of Wisdom, but Princess Zelda scattered it across the land of Hyrule before she was captured, and it's now up to you, Link, Perpetual series hero, to get those pieces, reform the Triforce, and then beat up Ganon to get the other one and rescue Zelda. At least that's what I get from the famously bad translation. You also get a list of the game's items and, somewhat uniquely, the advice that you should read the manual. The original Legend of Zelda had a famously long and detailed manual which basically acted as a way to get folks started in the game so that you weren't left completely on your own. Good thing too, because once you enter your name and begin, you are on your own. I was kind of surprised at how the original Legend of Zelda basically lets you do anything you want. You could even walk off the first screen without getting that sword, although you probably wouldn't last long if you did. Even that's seen as an important part of the game by the creators, to immediately get the player tuned into discovering things instead of them just being given to you. But in the main, you can go anywhere. There's 8 dungeons dotted around the overworld, and you don't have to do them in order. It's kind of likely that the first dungeon you stumble across won't actually be the first one, just depending on where you end up travelling from that start screen. So there isn't really any levels as such or a linear path. From the beginning, you make your own way. Of course, there are plenty of important items dotted around the place, either bought in shops or found in dungeons, so you can't just immediately do everything in any order. There's things that you need, such as a piece of meat to feed to a Goryo in the 7th dungeon, and candles that burn bushes, as well as optional upgrades. You don't need to get 250 rupees to buy a blue ring and halve the damage you take, but it sure is useful, as is the magical shield upgrade. Getting money isn't really all that hard in theory. It can be kind of annoying grinding it out by killing various monsters, but there are lots of secret areas to be found by bombing walls or burning bushes, where you'll be gifted cash with the quintessentially English phrase, "It's a secret to everybody." Of course, you have to actually find those secrets. Sometimes they're kind of obvious, other times, well, they are not at all. It's no real surprise that this game essentially created strategy guides. Without one, you could well find yourself bombing every rock, trying to burn every bush, in the hope of getting yourself unstuck. Aside from that, what helps you in the end is your own intuition and experience as you play the game more and more. That's the main thing I found slowly getting better as I played through the game, of course. At least that's what I felt getting better. Aside from extra energy obtained through heart containers, Link doesn't have any traditional stats to level up, but you do get an adventurous feel for the world. The overworld map helps with this. Rather than explicitly being a miniature guide to the entire world, it only tells you roughly where you are, and it's up to you to memorise paths and figure out landmarks. The world not being that huge in the grand scheme of things helps with that, but the overworld itself is memorable and varied enough so that you know where you're going, even if some parts, such as the repeating screen that you need to traverse in a specific way to get to the graveyard, are presumably fiendish without having some sort of guide or clue. When The Legend of Zelda came out, the folks manning the Nintendo helpline were apparently working overtime just on this game alone, and it's easy to see why. As for combat, yeah, it's a good. While I've not played this much, I have played another game heavily inspired by it very extensively, so The Legend of Zelda was kind of familiar from the get-go. You fight mainly with your sword. If you have full health, it can be a projectile, which is very handy indeed, especially after fully upgrading to the magical sword in the late game. When you're not attacking, your shield can block a multitude of shots, particularly if it's the magical one. The B button, along with being used for items, is also used for various sub-weapons that you get through the game. There's the boomerang, which stuns enemies, or the bow and arrow, which kills them even if it costs rupees to fire it. The best weapon in the late game is the magic rod, which hurts most enemies as well as lighting up dark rooms in the dungeon. There's a nice variance, and they're all pretty fun. Generally, the combat is great, and again, you find yourself getting more comfortable even with the toughest enemies like the Wizrobes and the Dark Nuts as you progress and learn just how they operate. Still, you can get into trouble from time to time. Potions can help, so long as you figure out how to actually get them, and occasionally enemies also drop the odd hearts and fairy that will boost your life, as well as bombs, keys and rupees. Which kind of brings us on neatly to dungeons, the main part of the whole thing. Now I love these dungeons. There's often a little bit of puzzling and bombing to try and figure out where to go, but it isn't overkill. Every room often presents a new challenge, especially because enemies don't just become stronger in terms of attacks and hit points. Again, they're quite varied. It's actually fun to get into a fight with a lot of the tough ones, even if you don't necessarily have to fight all the time. Sometimes you can just bomb a wall or even leave a room if you don't feel like it. Ideally, you pick up a dungeon map and a compass along the way so that you know where the boss room is. These guys often present their own unique challenge too, requiring a certain action in order to be beaten. Again, I imagine lots of people needed guides for some of that. The aforementioned meat, for example, or using the recorder to shrink the dig dogger. Sometimes you can find hints in the dungeon from various old men that can help out with your strategy, although the ropey translation can also leave them wide open for misinterpretation. It all culminates in a pretty epic final dungeon, the 9th dungeon, naturally only accessible after obtaining all 8 Triforce pieces and bombing one of 2 rocks that take the form of a pair of spectacles. This was probably my favourite part of the game, all told. It's a fantastic final exam for all that you've learnt, taking on the toughest enemies, getting yourself prepared for the challenge ahead, figuring out what walls to bomb and what blocks to move. It's pretty damn big, of course, especially as you also need to find the silver arrow to have any hope of defeating Ganon himself. The final battle is actually a little bit disappointing to me. He's largely invisible, and when he appears he's a totally static sprite, and if you're fully prepared and upgraded, he's gonna fall kinda quick with 4 hits of the magical sword and 1 silver arrow that turns him to ash. It is perhaps not the epic final showdown that you'd hope for, but still, the satisfaction on beating the game is pretty damn high. Seeing as a lot of games didn't really have all that much in the way of endings at all in 1986, Zelda's one, again, is pretty rewarding. So, we come to that question with a fairly obvious answer. Is this game still worth playing today? Yes, of course it is. The original Legend of Zelda is fantastic. It does make you feel like you've been on a big old adventure and that you've come out the other side with tons more experience and skill than what you had coming in. It's a game that you feel a very active part of, which was the intention. You aren't just along for the ride here. The music and presentation are obviously so iconic that they barely need any kind of mention, but the game itself, yeah, it's still great. Was that in any way a surprise? Well, in a way. I did kind of expect that while playing the game, I'd have to try and get into a sort of 1986 mode, thinking that everything would have been fantastic for 1986, even if it maybe hadn't held up so well now. As someone who mostly plays old games, I don't usually have much trouble getting into that frame of mind, but with The Legend of Zelda, I really didn't need to do that at all. The reason for this, perhaps, is because even after all this time, the original Legend of Zelda is still highly influential on games that are being released right now. In the past few years, there's been a huge tilt towards games that are these open-ended adventures, where you're free to go wherever, fight whoever, and you're essentially left on your own with no hand to guide you, often with naught but cryptic hints to go on. The most obvious game of this type is that old chestnut Dark Souls, another game I kinda need to play, but that game is quite obviously influenced by the original Legend of Zelda, and it has spawned countless imitators. Even the Legend of Zelda series itself, in its latest incarnation, has essentially gone back to basics. Breath of the Wild is an utterly open-ended adventure. Kinda like Dark Souls perhaps? Yes, but also like the very first game in the series, and loved because of that. So it was surprising to me just how current the Legend of Zelda felt. Maybe if I'd played it 10 years ago it wouldn't have felt so current, but in games the sense of exploration, of adventure, and yes, getting yourself utterly lost is back in a very big way. Unsurprisingly, I did need a walkthrough at various points to make my way through this game, although I think that's probably true for most of the people who played it back then, so no big deal. In the end, it's been a lot of fun to educate myself on this game. It's another time where I wondered if a Nintendo game was as good as everyone always said it was, and another time where it ended up going way above expectations. The last one was Super Metroid. Perhaps my general ignorance stifled any major hype, but as iconic as the game is, that didn't matter once I actually got into it and it sunk the hooks in, which it basically did effortlessly. There have been certain classic games, your Mega Mans and the like, that have never done it for me no matter how hard I've tried. But with The Legend of Zelda, I didn't even need to try. It certainly makes me want to play more Zelda games, that's for sure. Maybe I should just go straight to the sequel, Zelda 2: The Adventure of Link. I mean, the sequel should certainly be everything that made the first game so great, only even better, right? I'm sure that's the best path to go down. Anyway, bye for now. Many thanks for watching this video. If you liked the video then please like it and support me on social media, and also maybe have a look at my Patreon, where you could join a list of these awesome people here. Andrew Dalton, Handicapped, Asobi Kwan DX, Chris Cox, Conrad Pritchard, Daniel Briggs, Dave Cork, David Rose, Dustin Cooper, Gary Samaden, Geordie Alex, James Brown, James Loveridge, Jason Stevens, Jace Alexander, Jeff Ladd, Lee Norris, Lukas Kilagowski, Matthias Gramzov, Martin Pataki, Nicholas Tristan, Nick Smith, Nicky and Bunty, Peter Jack, Potter Margel, Ren Bimon, Are You OK 2000, Seth Robinson, Simon Gulliver, Yoka Operator, Zach Roach, and to all the rest of the community, thank you and goodbye.